here with Dr. Glenn Sipersky. Dr. Gleb Sipersky. To be helpful for me, he said I can call him Dr. Gleb.
Okay.
And we're going to be talking a little bit on some of his expertise. He's an internationally recognized thought leader known as the disaster avoidance expert. And his mission is to protect leaders from the dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases. And he does this by a combination of his pragmatic business experience and also cutting edge neuroscience and behavioral economics research, developing the most effective strategies for making decisions, managing risk, developing strategic plans, and avoiding business disasters. A few books to keep in mind of some of his work. He has Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, published by Career Press. And then most recently, published by Changemaker Books, is Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Crisis. He's a prominent thought leader in lots of magazines, including Time Magazine, CBS News, Business Insider, CNBC, among others. He has 20 years plus consulting, coaching, research experience with his company, the Disaster Avoidance Experts, and also academic research as well as a cognitive neuroscientist. So thrilled he can join us here and kind of lead us in this session around how independent consultants, people, members of the Umbrex and Veritux communities, can help their clients and themselves plan and adapt for COVID-19. So thank you so much, Dr. Gleb, for being here. Just a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this, so if anybody misses it, we'll be sharing it out afterward. You can always add questions to the chat where I will be monitoring it as Dr. Gleb goes through his presentations. And you can also kind of raise your hand as we have some breaks for Q&As, and we'll kind of do Q&As that way as well. So, but don't wait till that point. Definitely add it to the chat, and I'll make sure we get to it as well. Okay, Dr. Gleb, take it away. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Naomi. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming. So we'll do the presentation and then we'll do the questions and answers at the end. And
Great.
as Naomi mentioned, this is based on my newest book, very quickly written. As for those who have written books know, it usually takes about 2 years from a book when it was contracted to get to print, and Changemakers Books really wanted this out fast. So we got this out fast. And that's what this presentation is based on. Resilience, adapt and plan for the new normal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. But let's talk a little bit about the start of the coronavirus pandemic. So cast your mind back to that time that seems ages ago, which was just February, March of 2020. So just 3 months ago. So what happened there? Well, one of the most prominent business leaders, entrepreneurs out there, Elon Musk, right? Pretty much everyone heard of him, I hope. He's the founder of Tesla and SpaceX. And on March 6th, he tweeted that the coronavirus panic is dumb. And this was at a time when the coronavirus was already starting to cause some serious problems in the US. People were dying and so on. Now, this, due to his following, this was retweeted 1.7 or had 1.7 million likes and was tweeted over 300,000 times. So it was a popular message. It was widely spread and unfortunately pretty problematic. As you can see, he made some very bad assessments of the pandemic. In the March 19th, he said that based on current trends, probably close to 0 new cases in the US by the end of April. Well, guess what? It's mid-June and we have over 2 million cases of COVID-19 here in the US. So he's very badly wrong, unfortunately. But that's new money. What about old money? People who really know what they're doing, maybe he is just exaggerating a bit. We know Elon Musk tends to do that. What about people who supposedly know what they're doing? Goldman Sachs. Don't get more old money than that. Their goal is to make good analysis of the financial situation so that their clients can make wise decisions. Now, in their investments, they estimated the US GDP growth, of course, as part of their analysis. And they said in the second quarter, on February 24th, they made an estimate that second quarter GDP growth would be only 2.7%. And it was a little lower than they anticipated because of COVID-19 was already starting to creep up. Now, just a few weeks later, just 3 weeks later, on March 15th, they made a revision to their analysis. They said that US GDP growth would not be 2.7%, it would be instead of 5% decline. That's a huge change. 7.7%. That is major. Clearly, they screwed up their initial analysis. But what happened only 5 days later? On March 20th, they made another analysis and they said now it's going to be a 24% decline. So it went from a 5% decline to a 24% decline, 19% in just 5 days. Again, clearly they screwed up. The overwhelming amount of leaders, number of leaders were following either new entrepreneurial folks who are following Elon Musk or old money people who are the heads of large corporations, large traditional corporations following Goldman Sachs. So most were caught greatly unprepared. They underestimated their threat and they turned to the only thing they had, their business continuity plans. And as someone who's a disaster avoidance expert, I run a company called Disaster Avoidance Experts, as Naomi mentioned. I prepared a lot of these business continuity plans, disaster preparedness plans, whatever you call them. And I can tell you, they're not a good fit for the situation. That's not what they're for. Now, why is that? Well, they are great for emergencies, when a blizzard happened or when there's a major flood, like when Houston got flooded. That is a great time to use your business continuity plan. It's a 1 to 2 week interruption in business. It's a pretty serious issue, of course, but that's an emergency. That is what they're for. But COVID-19 is not an emergency. That's not what it is. It's a major disruptor. It's a slow-moving, high-impact, long-term threat. And we need to think of it as a marathon, not a sprint, not an emergency. So relying on business continuity plans leads us into serious problems. A lot of people suffered, a lot of businesses suffered as a result of relying on these business continuity plans, because running in emergency mode when they should be running in sprint mode, when they should be really running in marathon mode. That is the kind of thinking that still so many people fall into right now and make really bad decisions. Let's talk a little bit about timeline so we understand the timeline. Why do I say it's a marathon, not a sprint? I mean, a lot of businesses are opening up, going back to normal, looking to have normal situation. Well, unfortunately, the reality is we're not in a normal situation. Many people call it the new normal, and it's really not. It's the new abnormal. And so many people don't want to realize what it is. We'll really be only out of COVID-19 once we have an effective vaccine and people get vaccinated, mass numbers of people get vaccinated, something like over 70% to 80% to ensure herd immunity. So it's the only effective solution. But you have to understand that human trials for a vaccine will take at least a year if we want to get a safe and effective vaccine, at least a year. Because safety, so first, just so you understand what's happening, first you have trials for safety. And trials for safety, they take about 4 to 6 months to really show the effects, because sometimes effects are long-term, so the effects on the human body are long-term. So if we throw all the money at it, cut all the government red tape and do all the organization, the trials will still take 4 to 6 months on safety. And then trials on effectiveness will take around 8 months or so, 8 to 10 months, to really test whether COVID-19 antibodies, first of all, you need to test whether the vaccine does create antibodies, and then whether the antibodies are effective at preventing the disease. That takes many months. Now, there are going to be some shortcuts where trials on safety, if they seem initially good, then in a few weeks, they're less than the 6 months that they want to usually wait. They'll go to the trials of effectiveness, and there can be some shortcuts there. But you can really only compress it into about a year. And that is the minimal amount of time that it'll take to test out a vaccine after it's discovered. You probably heard a lot about vaccines being discovered. Well, the crucial thing is to test out their safety and effectiveness. So it's going to take at least a year, as opposed to the usual 4 to 5 years of testing out a vaccine. Now, you want to understand that most vaccines don't make it through human trials, unfortunately, but that's the reality. So all our past vaccines didn't make it through human trials. Most didn't. And we have only 25 diseases are actually something we can vaccinate against. It's really hard to find a good vaccine. And the first wave of vaccines that are currently in human trials, the Moderna vaccine, you might have heard of that, it went into human trials in something like mid-March. The first wave of vaccines, that and Johnson & Johnson, Gilead Science, they were rushed into production, which is appropriate. Nothing wrong with that. They should be rushed into production in this situation. But that means that they're especially unlikely to make it for human trials because they're rushed into production. So they're not as good as a vaccine that would be more thought out. And then after a vaccine is ready, well, what needs to happen? The government needs to happen the production, the distribution, and vaccination, mass vaccination. And I have to tell you, the government has not shown a high level of competence so far in whether in ramping up the testing regimen. You probably know quite a bit about that not great testing here in the US, not great. We don't have contact tracing that's nearly as good as contact tracing in other comparable well-developed countries and even less well-developed countries in the US. The government reacted obviously poorly to the initial stages, didn't really raise the alarms, begin acting in a timely manner. And then, of course, the personal PPE, the personal protective equipment, ventilators, lack of that, that does not give me great confidence in the government's ability to produce and distribute and vaccinate people. And you have to remember about people. I am not very confident about people. There's been polls showing that only about 50% of the population is actually said that they would take vaccine once that's available. So 50% of the population, that's not where we need to get to for herd immunity. So that provides another challenge. So we're not really in a great situation here with the vaccine. So let's talk about possible timelines. Optimistic, moderate, and pessimistic. We have an optimistic timeline. Now, that assumes that one of the first batch of vaccines, there are 8 to 10 that are currently in production, slated to go into human trials or already in human trials, that one of them will prove both safe and effective, which is a poor bet, but this is the optimistic scenario, summer 2021. Then we're assuming a high level of government competence. So let's say the government is much more competent than it has shown itself to be so far, excellently competent. Then the production, distribution, vaccination will take only 6 months. That's a very high level of government competence. So with that, summer 2021, then 6 months, most people will be vaccinated by early 2022. That's the optimistic timeline. And that's super optimistic. This is 25% chance, no more than that this is going to be where we live, where we end up. Then there's the moderate scenario. I'd say that this is the most likely scenario. The vaccine will be approved for mass production instead of by summer of 2021. It might be approved by end of 2021 to something like end of 2025. Let's give it that big 4-year time span. And 2023 will be the average. Then production, distribution, vaccination without a high level of government competence, only a moderate level of government competence. We can say that it's going to take about a year to produce, distribute, vaccinate people. And so most will be vaccinated by 2024. I'd say this is the 50% chance scenario. So this is the most likely thing that will happen. So if you want to bet on something. But we can turn out to be unlucky. The universe can give us the middle finger. This is the pessimistic scenario. It'll be approved for mass production by 2026 if it happens to be the case that creating a vaccine is quite a bit harder than we think. Then production, distribution, vaccination at a moderate level of government competence is a year, and then most people are vaccinated by 2027. This is, of course, the remaining 25% chance scenario. It's unfortunate, but you have to acknowledge that this is a possibility. You might think I'm too cynical, but something you might not realize is that we still don't have a vaccine for the flu. We've been trying to get that for over a century, but the only vaccine we have for the flu is only 50% effective. So, cutting the death rate of COVID-19 from its current death rate of 0.5 to 1% to 0.25 to 0.5%, somewhere in that range, that's still not great. We already have over 115,000 deaths here in the US. So the deaths will obviously keep growing, but only by us more slowly. It would not address the underlying dynamic of the pandemic. So that's what we have to deal with. And it's not easy to hear. I struggle with this information. I have to tell you, this is honestly, when I started learning about this, when I started researching it, I really struggled with this. This was hard for me to understand. I'm a disaster avoidance expert. I look at risk management decision making all the time, and it's hard for me to do this. And it was hard for me to persuade my clients that they really need to take this seriously. They need to take a marathon perspective, not a sprint, and they can't just use their emergency continuity plans. This is going to be a serious long-term major disruptor, and that's how they should think about this, not an emergency. But, I know, and I tell them and I tell myself that the longer it takes me and them to internalize this information, the more painful it will be. So it's really important for us in the long term to accept this painful information if we want to survive and thrive in the context of COVID-19. Now, if you take a look at the poll, right now I want to do the polling. So if you take a look at the Zoom poll, I will launch a poll. And you should be able to see this poll. So please vote in the poll. Go ahead. I see about half of the people voted. So please go ahead. Give folks about 5 more seconds to vote. All right, so as we can see, the poll is about how well prepared are your typical clients for the moderate scenario. So for the moderate scenario, the most likely scenario, nobody said that they're all set. 20% of the people said that they need some improvement. So for 20% of the people, they need some improvement, but for 80%, they'll need a lot of work. And that is very serious, of course. They'll need a lot of work. 80% of you, and you know your clients, you know who you're dealing with, so they'll need a lot of, I totally understand that. So this is something for you to realize. They will need a lot of work. And this is an area where you can really be a trusted advisor to them and bring them this information, which is painful for them to hear, painful for you, I'm sure for you to hear, painful for me to share, and painful for them to hear. But the sooner you accept it and the sooner they accept it, the more likely you are to survive and thrive in this scenario. And we'll talk about that, of course, going forward. So let's go on to talk about what we're facing, our future until widespread vaccination. So what we're seeing right now, in this time period, again, whether very optimistically, early 2022, moderate scenario, 2024, pessimistic scenario, 2026. What we're going to be seeing is situations like right now here in the US and many other countries around the world, especially in Europe. So Europe and the US mainly, some Asian countries which are hit earlier onward, is that after an initial period of this shutdown, there's going to be a loosening of restrictions. And so that's what we're seeing right now, a loosening of restrictions. And of course, we're also seeing an increase of cases as a result of a loosening in restrictions. So whether they're here in the US and areas like Arizona, Texas, Louisiana, and of course in other countries around the world, they saw the initial tightening, then loosening, then increase in cases. And following that, there's going to be tighter restrictions, and we already see a number of areas in the US tightening restrictions as a result of their increase in cases. So whether it's the medical system tightening its restrictions, so for example, the emergency medical plan has been activated in Arizona, or some areas actually rolling back their opening cases. So I think Utah has decided to stop some of the reopenings, and San Francisco has decided to do that as well, tightening restrictions, and there will be a decrease in cases. So that's what we're going to be seeing. And we're going to be seeing repeating waves of this. Various levels of social distancing with loose restrictions, increase in cases, tighter restrictions, decrease in cases. Over the next few years, hopefully it's only 2 years, but it might be as long as 4, or if we're really unlucky, many as 7 years, until we don't need to do the social distancing and shutdowns and this repeating waves. So that's what we're going to be facing. That's what your clients will be facing. And you want to realize that even in the optimistic scenario, the world will change forever. These waves of restrictions, they'll change everyone's habits, values, norms, desires, We'll never go back to January 2020. We have to realize that. It's a hard, difficult message to hear, to accept, to internalize, and to bring to your clients, but we really will never go back to that world again. That's not a reality. And your role as a trusted advisor, you need to understand that you're a trusted advisor to leaders. Your role is to help these leaders realize the extent of this major disruption. So many of them want to go back to normal, and they're not realizing their eyes aren't open to the extent of the major, huge disruption that they're in. They're way too optimistic. You need to help them prepare for this uncomfortable reality. That's your job as a trusted advisor. And believe me, if you help them do so, first of all, they'll be grateful to you for helping them accomplish their leadership goals once they get over the hump of realizing the uncomfortable reality. So they'll be grateful to you, and that's great. You'll help them accomplish their leadership goals. And of course, that will reinforce your role as a trusted advisor. It'll build that trust in you as a trusted advisor. So that's going to be another area which it will be beneficial for you as well to bring them this information. And I want to encourage you and help encourage them to not plan for the optimistic scenario. There are too many companies. They act as though everything is back to normal, problem will blow over soon, maybe it's blown over already, or it will blow over soon, maybe burn out in the summer or something like that. But remember this great phrase attributed to Vince Lombardi, that hope is not a strategy. And this actually, Vince Lombardi is a famous coach, so this is something that works well with executives, reminding them that hope is not a strategy. You want to prepare for the moderate or ideally pessimistic scenario. Now, the pandemic is a slow-moving threat, and we need to understand that we as human beings, because of the way our brain is wired, we make really bad decisions about threats that are unusual, slow-moving, low probability. Our gut reaction, our decision-making process tends to underestimate such threats, and that leads to bad decisions that endanger our businesses. Here's where I want to share a little bit about myself so you see where I'm coming from with my expertise in decision making. And so I'll talk about my experience first. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, as Naomi mentioned. It's a small boutique consulting, coaching, and training firm. And what we do is we help clients avoid disasters, manage risks, make good decisions, and make wise strategic plans. I also spent 15 years in academia, 20 years at 15 years in academia, researching all of these topics as a cognitive neuroscientist and behavioral economist, studying how the brain works, that's cognitive neuroscience, and how we behave in economic situations as a result of that, that's behavioral economics. And I published in prominent venues like Journal of Social and Political Psychology, Behavior and Social Issues, many others like this. So that's my experience. Now, I've worked with a whole bunch of clients from innovative startups to Fortune 500 companies, and the latter range from Aflac to Xerox. So if you know Zappos, give me a call. Then media. I have appeared, as Naomi mentioned, in a number of prominent media venues from Newsweek, Time, Inc., Fast Company, Scientific American, CBS, CNBC, NPR, and so on. I have over 550 articles and 450 interviews in these venues. And my books. So I published 3 best-selling books and 1 new one. Hopefully it becomes a bestseller. I'm best known for Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. That has a lot of case studies that you as consultants will find useful for how to manage the dangerous judgment errors that we tend to make and that leaders tend to make. Blind spots between us, how to overcome unconscious cognitive bias and build better relationships. That focuses, of course, specifically on relationships, professional as well as personal. Then the Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide, how to help those leaders open up their eyes and help yourself do so as well, how to figure out what is true and seek it. And finally, my newest book, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. Let's hope that becomes a bestseller because I think the message in it really needs to get out to a lot of people. So that's about me. Now, I want to talk a little bit about decision making. So I talked about decision making processes. How do we think? We are unfortunately very vulnerable to dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. And this is my actual area of academic expertise. I've studied this a lot. The dangerous judgment errors we tend to make because of how our brain is wired. They're called cognitive biases by cognitive neuroscientists and behavioral economists like myself. More colloquially, they're called dangerous judgment errors, mental blind spots, whatever. They come from a combination of our evolutionary background and how our brains are wired. So the structure of our brains causes some of these cognitive biases, and the evolutionary background causes some of these biases. I want to talk a little bit about one aspect of our evolutionary background that's particularly important for COVID-19. Our main response to threat is called the fight or flight. So fight or flight, that was great for the hunter-gatherers. Our evolutionary background, we are wired, our brains are wired, the emotions, the gut reactions that people, when people say go with your gut, follow your intuition, trust your heart, they're saying do what you feel is right. And our feelings, our instincts are not adapted for the modern world. They're adapted for that savanna environment. So that was great for them when the risks were immense, were immediate, intense in the moment. Saber-toothed tigers, you might have heard of it as the saber-toothed tiger response, when we had to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. But it's really dangerous to use that same response in the modern world. We have many less saber-toothed tigers. The risks we face are long-term, uncertain. They might come from a notification on your smartphone about an article where somebody forwards you an article about some weird disease somewhere in the middle of China. That's where our threats come from, and we're not wired to respond well to threats like this. There are specifically three cognitive biases I want to talk about that are especially relevant for COVID-19. Now, we tend to assume that the world will mostly be the same in the future. We feel like the world will be the same. In the savanna environment, think about yourself in 5 years from now. What will you be like? You'll probably realize, it's going to be, some kind of current version of myself, maybe a little bit wiser, a little bit more gray hair, something like that. Hopefully a little bit more money, right? So that's the tendency, that's how we feel. But remember back to yourself 5 years ago. You'll probably realize you are a very different person in very many ways. And I realize that when I think back to myself 5 years ago. But when I think about myself 5 years from now, I just think I'll be a slightly more improved version of myself. I don't realize that in 5 years from now, I'll just be very likely just as different as I was 5 years ago. It's very not intuitive. That's not how we tend to perceive the world. But it's true, I'll very likely be very different in 5 years. In the savanna environment, that was not the case. Our world was going to be very much similar to what it was in the past. So we tend to assume that everything will keep going normally. And so we greatly underestimate the changes in our world because we forecast the short-term future based on the short-term past. And so we underestimate the likelihood and the impact of major disruptors. In the modern world, we have many more disruptors, whether technological disruptors, there are many of those recently, the fiscal crisis of 2008, 2009, or of course the COVID-19 pandemic. We greatly underestimate the impact and the reality of this. So many people are trying to get back to normal right now. They're falling into normalcy bias, even though the world is not normal. Planning fallacy. Now, we tend to be very confident about our plans. We feel like, hey, we made a plan, the future will go according to this plan. That is a big problem in our thought pattern. It leads us to greatly underestimate various risks, various problems that plague our typical plans. So we underestimate the resources that we need to address these risks, these problems. Time, money, social capital, time for strategic planning. Of course, all of that stuff is something we underestimate. And that's another problem, big problem with COVID-19, that a lot of people are still trying to stick to their old strategic plans, their old ways of going forward, and not realizing they need to pivot. Finally, hyperbolic discounting. Now, we tend to be very short-term oriented, and that was great in the savanna environment when we had to live for the short term because we really couldn't make good plans for the long term, and we couldn't invest resources into the long term. If we killed the mammoth, we needed to eat as much of its meat as possible and stuff our stomachs and get nearly sick because the meat would rot. So couldn't use that later. But of course, in the modern world, we have refrigerators. We don't kill mammoths. We make money and we put that in the bank. And we can develop our careers. We can invest in ourselves going forward. And of course, what are you going to be in the savannah? What are you going to become a better X chipper or something? That doesn't work in the savannah. It works now. And of course, we can also improve our companies going forward. But that's not how we feel. We really orient toward the short term. Our feelings, our gut reactions orient toward the short term. And there are so many right now companies, leaders that are very oriented toward the short term. They just want to reopen. They want to get back to normal. They're not realizing how much it will cost them, how many problems there are. I'm seeing restaurants open up that I mean, how are they making a profit with 50%? Anyway, talk about that. There are many examples of where they're really making bad decisions. So we tend to underestimate the long-term outcomes and impacts of our behaviors. And that is something that we need to realize that we are very prone to. All right, so at this point, I'm going to launch another poll. So take a look at the polling options. And I want to ask, which of these dangerous judgment errors might be the biggest danger for your clients? Normalcy bias, hyperbolic discounting, or the planning fallacy? Please vote. All right, so 50% of the people voted. Let's give the rest a little bit more time. 5 more seconds. All right, so we see that the people who voted hyperbolic discounting is not so much of a problem. Planning fallacy is the biggest problem for 25% of you. So 25% of you say that planning fallacy is the biggest problem for you. But the normalcy bias is overwhelmingly the biggest problem, not for you, but for your clients. So the planning fallacy for 25%, normalcy bias for 75%. So this is the biggest problem that your clients are facing. Good to know and good to understand and think about this going forward. How are you going to address the normalcy bias facing your clients? All right. In order to prepare effectively for COVID-19 and help your clients prepare, what you need to realize for dealing with the normalcy bias and other cognitive biases, you need to help them make long-term changes to their plans and make long-term changes to your plans, of course, for your own career as an independent consulting professional, as an independent professional. Think about it in years, not weeks, really years, not weeks. For businesses to prepare, they need to make fundamental, basic changes to their business model. They want to help them focus on a future with virtual interactions. Make a commitment to virtual teams and offerings. Something I'm very strongly advising my clients is to end up office space, give up their office space lease or sell their office space. This is a great way of freeing up some money right now and investing it instead into various professional development and virtual collaboration that they'll need in the future and you'll need in the future. So let's talk about the areas of change in the internal business model. Then we'll talk about the external business model. There are 6 areas of change that I want to highlight in each for switching to virtual interactions. You want to look at the internal controls. Of course, financial security. There's going to be different financial security when you're dealing with virtual teams than when you're dealing with in-person activities. So think about that. Help them think about that. We're identifying all the things where you need to help your clients. Prevent cybersecurity vulnerabilities. There's much more hacking going on right now, according to the FBI, since COVID-19. So many people are working from home because many people are not used to working from home and they don't follow the cybersecurity protocols that they should follow. Their software and their hardware aren't hardened against external threats nearly as much. So we don't have antivirus or not good enough antivirus and so on. So that's another area. You want to adapt your existing and help your clients adapt existing compliance practices to the virtual setting. So there's going to be a number of compliance practices that you want to be thinking about, and also pursue compliance with CDC guidelines to the extent that you have in-office activities. I strongly recommend that my clients give up all of their in-person activities, but some still need to retain some in-person activities, especially if they're doing manufacturing, stuff like that. Mining, those you can do obviously from office space. So you need to pursue compliance with CDC guidelines. And of course, if you want to have an in-person meeting about such a serious issue, you want to pursue those CDC guidelines. And you want to revise your internal measurements of effectiveness and efficiency. Lots of people don't realize that they need to do this. They need to really revise their internal measurements because they will apply differently to the virtual environment. Motivation engagement. Now, already before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, only 34% of employees were fully engaged, and this is according to extensive surveys by Gallup over the years. 34% of employees were fully engaged. And of course, that means that over 50% were not engaged. Full engaged means creative, innovative, problem solving. Most of the people, over 50%, something like 59% or so, are passive. They're somewhat disengaged, meaning they're just coming in, punching the clock, doing the bare minimum they need to get by, and ready to leave for a better opportunity when one presents itself. About 15% are actively hostile. They're bad-mouthing the company to others. They're actively undermining the internal morale, ready to steal from the company, looking for a new opportunity actively. Of course, what happens is that working from home, unfortunately, undermines the motivation engagement that we feel because we're very tribal creatures. So when we're surrounded by others, we do what they do. That's just the nature of who we are. So we lack that motivation. And there's a stress of adjusting to their personal life, household in case of the pandemic, kids being home, teenagers being home from college, kids being home from school. You need to provide support and guidance to your employees and help the companies you work with, the clients you work with do so as well. Effective communication. Now, it's notoriously difficult to communicate even in person. And when you're going to switch from in-person to virtual communications, there's a lot of things that are lost. When you switch, overwhelmingly people switch to software, the collaboration software like Slack, Trello, Asana, Microsoft Teams. It's going to be written communication only instead of the full range of our expression. And of course, you lose body language, you lose tone of voice. When I say something like, I think Sam should take that project, or I say, I think Sam should take that project, those two sentences mean very different things, but when you write them down, they mean the same thing. It's essential to train employees. This is a matter of professional development. You need to train them on effective virtual communication. And you also need to train them on resolving conflicts. Now, in face-to-face interactions, it's pretty easy for people who have a little bit of emotional and social intelligence to spot problems. When you are communicating with someone, you can see that there is anxiety, fear, some stress in their body language. You can check in with them, address it in the moment, and resolve it. Now, in a virtual team, that doesn't happen. It's much harder to notice problems. And then, of course, it's also hard to resolve them because of the communication effectiveness issues. So this is another area where it's really important for your clients to offer professional development to their staff and for you yourself to learn how to deal with these problems effectively. Cultivating trust. This is not something that you typically think about because in office settings, cultivating trust comes naturally. When we meet, talk about over the water cooler about your kids, your sports, your vacation plans, everything like that. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen naturally in virtual settings, but it can be created. You want to create a venue for this. This is not a matter of professional development. This is just creating a venue for doing so. Next, accountability. In the office environment, it's much easier to hold people accountable. If you're a supervisor, you walk around, you see what people are doing, you engage with them, you chat with them, notice their body language, and address issues in the moment. You can't do that in a virtual team. Also, as a peer-to-peer accountability, you can hold somebody much more accountable. You can pop into Mary's office and say, hey, Mary, where's that report that you promised me? Well, it's much harder to ignore you standing there than it is to ignore a Slack message. So you want to create a new structures to address these accountability issues. And by the way, we can talk about that in the Q&A, what can be done about all this, so just to be clear. This accountability must be up the chain of command, hierarchical, and peer-to-peer accountability as well. So both of those levels of accountability. Next, your external business model. So that's the 6 areas of internal, 6 areas of external. The first one to think about is service delivery. You want to transition your offerings to virtual as much as possible or socially distanced. So of course, as someone who is a consultant, coach, and trainer myself, I transition pretty much everything to virtual interactions. And there's certainly some business lost when you do that. I can guarantee that to you that there's business lost and certain people, they don't want anything besides in-person consulting and coaching and speaking and training, but you can do a lot over video, especially if you use new technology like I'm using right here to do this presentation, Prezi video. Some will find it easier than others, people who are flexible, people who are creative and innovative and entrepreneurial, and whose businesses are more of a good fit for it. So be creative. But for some businesses, the best choice may be to close. I'm being very frank here. This is not a good time to run a restaurant business because restrictions. There's opening up right now, but there will be restrictions again, and they'll be closing. So I strongly recommend to businesses, restaurants that are not well set up to do takeout to just not really open up. And we can talk about that later. Relationships. You want to think about cultivating relationships, both existing relationships and establishing new relationships virtually. And this is a skill. This is a skill that you can be learned with existing stakeholders. Here we're talking about the external business model. So clients, service providers of various sorts, political leaders, which are especially important right now with the stimulus being passed around and the government hanging out money, prospects, investors, suppliers, all sorts of folks. You want to invest in professional development. This is an area that you can get better at for professional development. Managing disruptions. So think about what kind of disruptions you'll be facing due to the external stakeholders, because a number of them will not be nearly as savvy as you who's checking out this webinar and getting prepared for the situation. And you want to make plans to protect yourself from their failures. Then unknown unknowns. First, shifting norms. So shifting norms are norms we discussed after several years of restrictions and loosenings will never be the same. We'll never go back to January 2020. We'll have different norms, wants, desires, expectations, and habits. Think about where and help your clients realize where their prospects will be. What will be the norms, values, desires in a couple of years from now? Get ahead of the norm. Get ahead of these shifts. Then you'll be positioned where the market is going to be, and that's a wise position to be. Unknown unknowns. So some things we don't know. Now the pandemic was a known unknown. It was a predictable disaster, and there were not many people who predicted it, including Bill Gates and so on. But of course, the overwhelming amount of folks didn't predict it because they weren't looking out for it, and they weren't listening to Bill Gates and others who were talking about it. So you want to scan your environment for these major disasters, for these major disruptors, and protect yourself against them. Some things you can't protect yourself against, you can't predict. The pandemic was predictable, but some things aren't going to be. A cash cushion will be helpful for those things. And finally, outcompete your competition. This is something that your clients will really love. My clients really love this part. So outcompeting your competition is a really great payoff, because the steps I shared, so if you take them and if you help your clients take them, of course, then you'll be at a competitive advantage. Your clients will be at a competitive advantage, because many will fail to adapt to the pandemic. They'll stumble. And this is an opportunity to get ahead of these stumbling competitors, to seize market share and to hire away good employees. All right, take a look at the polling questions. So we'll run a poll, and I'm curious to learn how well adapted to the pandemic are the internal and external organizational models of your typical clients. Are they really well adapted, moderate changes needed, or serious revisions needed? So both the internal and external models for your typical clients. Okay, so I see that over 50% of the people voted. Great, so 71% voted. Okay, we'll give 5 more seconds and we'll finish up. Great, so we see that for the internal and external organizational models of your clients, none are really well adapted, unfortunately. 20% are moderate, so need some moderate changes, so those are things to work on. But 80% need really serious revisions, and that's something to realize that. This is something the case for a lot of businesses. They need really serious revisions in order to survive and thrive in the pandemic. So this is something really important information to bring to your clients. All right. And let's talk about going forward. What can we do to go forward effectively? So I want to talk about how to plan for the long-term impact of the pandemic. What you want to help your clients do, and this I describe in much more depth in my book, look at the possible futures. What possible future are they facing? A good way to think about this, and of course you'll want to adapt it to your own context, to your client's context, but a good basic way to think about this is to think about the optimistic scenario, the moderate scenario, and the pessimistic scenario, because these will really determine when we finish with the pandemic, and then you want to invest your resources accordingly. So think about where you'll be 5 years out in each of these scenarios, the optimistic one, the moderate one, and the pessimistic one, and where will your client be in 5 years in each of these scenarios. Think about the problems that will face them. List them in each scenario and think of ways to address them in advance. So if let's say if you have a manufacturing client. And then what you can look at is having supply chain disruptions that aren't simply a one-time thing, as so many manufacturing clients think, okay, it'll be a one-time thing, but they don't realize that there'll be repeating waves of this disease going forward. And that if they have supply chains, their supply chains will be endangered, especially to the extent that they have supply chains in other countries like China. So many have supply chains in East Asia and so on. So you want to think about how to address these supply chains issues in advance, as opposed to just thinking that, okay, this blew over. Or make a plan to resolve problems if they do occur. Then opportunities. Think about what opportunities you might have in this pandemic and what opportunities your clients might have. One thing that we already talked about a little bit is that your competitors will be stumbling because they're not going to be nearly as well prepared as you, and not nearly as well prepared as you'll help your clients be. So think of ways that you can right now take advantage of the situation. You can say something like you can work with your clients for the sales department and say, hey, here are the way, and tell them to go to their prospects who are currently working with their competitors and say, hey, Mrs. Prospect or Mr. Prospect, I've taken these steps A through F to be pandemic proof, and kind of list them out. I don't know if my competitor has taken these steps. So if they happen to stumble in the context of a pandemic and it turns out to be worse than they think it is and that you think it is, then hey, how about giving me a call, shooting me an email? And you know what? They'll remember you when the pandemic is worse and when your competitor stumbles. Or of course, make a plan to seize them if they occur. Then think about resources. What kind of resources will you need for each scenario? Money, time, information, social capital, strategic planning. So you'll want, for example, to seize market share, you'll want some strategic planning for taking advantage of your competitor stumbling. And of course, there'll be a little bit of money and time invested into that. And the same thing for changing your supply chains. There'll be more money and time invested into that. And you want to make a plan, sufficient resources for the pessimistic scenario. I strongly recommend this. If you can't, at least the moderate scenario. Don't plan for the optimistic scenario. And finally, think about information. What information would you use to assess which scenario is taking place? The optimistic one, the moderate one, the pessimistic one. You want to look at this information, monitor it closely, then adjust your plans accordingly and execute against your plans. So this is your goals. This is the how to plan for the long-term impact of the pandemic effectively, as opposed to falling into planning fallacy. All right, so take a look at tinyurl.com/de-event. Go to that for additional resources from the pandemic. Free coaching session with me about how to adapt the situation, whether to your business as an independent consultant or to help your clients do so. And 2 chapters from my new book, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. So that is what I wanted to share with you today. And I look forward to any questions that you might have at this stage. So you can put them into the chat, and that will be that.
Great. So I added the tiny URL to the chat if anyone wants to just kind of copy and paste it from there. I'd be, as people are kind of thinking of any questions they want to have, I'd be curious to hear a little bit more, Dr. Gleb, about your preparation for this book and kind of, which sections are you finding clients are leaning on more now, or have kind of really been the most useful in the last few months as we kind of really think of that long-term picture?
What I've been finding is that the parts that I shared about adapting their internal business model and their external business model have been the most helpful because they don't really think about the situation. They're not yet quite ready for the strategic planning. They're still kind of trying to figure out how do you adapt to the reality of what we're dealing with, how do you go toward the future. There's a lot of revisions needed as they change their business models, of course, from the previous ones to their in-person ones to the much more virtual ones. And I want to be clear, not all of my clients have yet switched to virtual models. They've definitely switched to hybrid models, where they've permanently committed to keeping some of their staff at home and they're reducing their footprint. But some of them are still doing that in-office thing that I'm discouraging them from doing, but they're definitely moving away from that as they're seeing the reality. Especially right now, I've just had a client who 3 days ago, based in Phoenix, and Arizona is one of the areas that's hardest hit with the reopenings, with the uptick in cases. That has really convinced them that they need to move to all virtual all the time, and so we're working on that. So that it's a process, and that's the areas that they're finding most helpful right now. I anticipate once they're settled down a little bit and they're figured out their new both internal business model and external business model, the strategic planning and the decision making accompanying that will become quite a bit more important because their strategic plans are in tatters. I mean, that's the reality of the situation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes sense. So we have a question from Mehan who says, thank you, love the insights. Wondering about thinking tools or models and processes you recommend in trying to do planning in this environment.
Mm-hmm. So what I would strongly discourage you from is using tools like SWOT. SWOT is notorious for really being bad for leaders in contexts of changing environments. They greatly overestimate their strengths, their opportunities. They greatly underestimate their weaknesses and their threats. So stay away from SWOT in these changing environments, dynamic environments. That's not a good tool. A good tool, if you know how to use it well, is the kind of scenario planning that I outlined really briefly in the strategic plan. So that section, if you take a look at the so imagine what your business would look like in 3 years in each of these scenarios, the optimistic one, the moderate one, and the pessimistic one. That's a version of scenario planning that I adapted for the reality of the pandemic and for addressing cognitive biases. So that's something that you want to be thinking about. That's a good tool to be thinking about. Scenario planning has been shown to address a lot of these typical problems when you adapt it and use it well and address cognitive biases as part of scenario planning. So that's something that I would recommend that you use in strategic planning for the situation. And of course, as part of strategic planning, what you definitely want to do is address the cognitive biases specifically that I described and that we voted on people. So that's the most important: normalcy bias, planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting.
I also had one more question around kind of the regionality of the COVID-19 and thinking of how, depending on where your clients are located and the geographic spread of their business, how that might affect their business model or their thinking. You mentioned that, we're very tribal, but also thinking on the, how businesses in LA might be thinking about things versus businesses in Chicago or businesses in Dallas, and kind of thinking on if you have any thoughts around how our clients can, make their plans based off of where they are, but not limit their solutions really based off of where they are.
I haven't seen so much variation based on where they are, as much as variation along their ideological political alignment, because there's unfortunately a lot of politicization around COVID-19 right now, and there are a number of people who are, due to their ideological alignment, dismissing the seriousness of the situation and not really taking it as seriously as they should. And there's some geographical variation in areas like, I gave the example of Arizona, right? The client who's a wealth management firm there they were previously not taking it as seriously as I was describing it. They trust me, they rely on me, but they also have their own predilections, ideological predilections. But now that they've seen that, hey, cases are actually, that my predictions came true, right? I was telling them that the wave, there will be an increase in cases that will become more serious than they think, rather than less serious, which is what they were thinking. And now they're saying, okay, now my predictions are accurate, and they're going to take the steps that I was suggesting. So that's something that I've seen in terms of regionally, and in the region that depends on the kind of combination of government policies and the local rise or decrease in cases. But I think ideological differences play more of a role, unfortunately. This really shouldn't be an ideological issue, but it has become a political football in the context of the 2020 election, at least here in the US. Around the world, I mean, I work something like 80% of my clients are US based, but the 20% that aren't, they don't see this as a political issue. They just see this as a health issue.
Yeah, just one example of this, and to kind of put some context, is I have some close friends and colleagues in Redmond, Washington, where Microsoft is based. And Microsoft very early, well, Washington State in general was an early hotspot. Microsoft in particular very early went completely virtual,
Yeah.
before most large companies, which then made the whole region go virtual much faster than all the companies. And so all the companies that were servicing Microsoft, all the, restaurant, everything just adapted much faster, which helped lower the cases, but then also kind of normalized the need to rethink your business model, rethink your kind of strategies and things like that. So it's interesting, right?
It is.
In terms of if there's any kind of business leaders who are really kind of setting a precedent.
It is.
Great. All right. Well, we have a couple of questions or a couple of minutes left. Dr. Gleb put the link to his most recent book in the chat, so feel free to check it out there. We'll keep this open, but just want to say thank you so much. This has been, as you mentioned, painful to hear, but important to hear. And I think the more practical resources and tools that we have in supporting our clients, the more useful we are as independent consultants. And so definitely kind of want to share our deep gratitude for your time today.
You're very welcome. And like I said, if anyone wants, I'll be happy to do a coaching session with you on adapting it to your business, or helping you adapt it, a free coaching session, of course, helping adapt it to your client's business at tinyurl.com/d-event.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And we'll share this recording and in tomorrow's newsletter as well.
Have a great day, everyone.
All right,
Bye-bye.
thanks. Bye.